At exactly 300 hours on November 11th, 2024, Veterans Day, I learned that the people who share your blood can be the first to spit on everything you've ever fought for. The air outside Fort Liberty was sharp with cold when I pushed open the front door to base housing. The hallway lights were dim, the kind of silence that only exists before dawn. Inside, Evan sat slouched on the couch with a half-empty bottle hanging loosely from his hand. His bare feet were propped against the coffee table like he owned the place. He wasn't supposed to be here at this hour, but that had never stopped him before. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't anything close to one. He was just my stepbrother. And that night, he looked at me like my uniform meant nothing. On the wall behind him hung my Army Commendation Medal, the same one they pinned to my chest after I pulled two soldiers out of a burning vehicle during training in Arizona. I hadn't touched that medal since the ceremony. I didn't need to. It wasn't about the medal. It was about what it meant. Evan stood slowly swaying a little. The smell of cheap whiskey drifted across the room. He smirked at me, that same smirk I'd seen since childhood, the one that said he could get away with anything because someone would always clean up after him. He dragged out my name like a taunt, then turned toward the medal. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. He spat. The sound was soft, almost nothing, but it hit the glass like a gunshot. A streak of spit slid slowly down over the metal's surface, leaving a trail that caught the light from the kitchen. His voice came next, cutting through the stillness. "You're weak, Morgan. A medal doesn't make you a soldier." I felt the words slide under my skin like ice water. Weak. That word wasn't meant to be said in this house. Not to me. The kitchen light threw his shadow long across the floor. I stood completely still, my fingers locked around the strap of my bag, my lungs tight. Through the wall, I heard it, a soft laugh. My mother, my stepfather. They were awake. They heard everything. Then came the words that burned worse than the insult. "She's too dramatic." My jaw clenched until it ached. That medal wasn't a decoration. It carried the smell of burned fabric, the sound of a soldier gasping for air, the weight of every moment I had chosen to step forward when others hesitated. And here was Evan, drunk and worthless, treating it like nothing. He leaned closer, close enough for me to smell the sour whiskey on his breath. He whispered again, quieter but sharper. Weak. That one word felt like a line being carved into the floor between us. He wanted me to break. He wanted to see it. But I didn't. My hand moved up slowly. I took the medal down from the wall. My fingers brushed against the glass, still wet, still warm. He expected shouting, maybe a punch, maybe tears. I gave him silence. That was the first time his grin faltered. I walked past him, every step deliberate, the floor creaking under my boots. I passed the kitchen, the closed bedroom door where the people who should have protected me pretended not to exist, and opened the front door again. The night air hit me like a slap. It smelled like pine iron and rain. I stood on the porch with the medal in my hand, watching the breath rise from my mouth in thin white clouds. The glass caught the faint red light of a passing security vehicle and threw it back like a warning flare. Inside, his laugh echoed again, but softer this time, uncertain. He didn't know it, but everything shifted in that moment. Something in me hardened. A line had been crossed and I wasn't going back. Before that night, I would have swallowed it, carried it alone like I always did, but not anymore. Not after he spat on what I earned. Not after they laughed. Before I tell you what happened after that night, tell me, have you ever been betrayed by the people who should have protected you? I used to believe my family was unshakable. Back then, before Fort Liberty, before the medals, before the cold silence of 0300 hours, I thought we were the kind of family people admired from a distance. My mother had remarried when I was 11. She met Thomas Riley at a church fundraiser in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was charming, the kind of man who shook hands, firmly remembered everyone's names, and had a smile that could make people forget to ask real questions. He owned a small construction company, wore khaki pants even on Sundays, and called everyone buddy. At the wedding, my mother looked like the happiest woman alive. I remember sitting on a folding chair in the second row, clutching a bunch of wilting flowers and convincing myself that maybe, finally, things were going to be okay. And then there was Evan, 2 years older than me. Blonde hair, loud laugh. The kind of boy who was used to being the sun in every room he entered. He became my stepbrother that summer, and overnight, he was treated like family royalty. My mother adored him almost immediately, like she had been waiting her entire life to call someone like him son. When people talk about all-American families, I think of the front porch of that house. White railing, an American flag waving out front, matching Christmas sweaters every year, smiles so practiced they felt laminated. My stepfather loved to tell people how proud he was of his kids, but it was always Evan standing next to him in the pictures. I was the quiet one, the shadow at the edge of every frame. At first I didn't mind. I liked quiet. But quiet has a way of turning into something heavier when people start treating it like invisibility. Evan was the golden boy. Teachers adored him. My mother bragged about him like he had cured cancer every time he passed a math test. At barbecues, neighbors would pat his shoulder and say, "That's a good young man right there," while I sat at the picnic table with a paper plate and a polite smile, wondering what it felt like to be seen like that. When I joined ROTC in high school, no one noticed. When Evan made the football team, my mother baked cupcakes for the entire school. The first time I scored the top marks at a drill meet, she said, "That's nice, honey," without even looking up from stirring pasta sauce. I learned to bury my pride deep where no one could mock it. My stepfather loved to talk about discipline, about how his household was built on respect, but the rules only ever seemed to apply to me. If I came home 5 minutes late, there was a lecture about responsibility. If Evan disappeared for a whole weekend, it was boys will be boys. If I rolled my eyes at a remark, I was ungrateful. If Evan threw a tantrum, he was just stressed. It was like living inside a glass box, watching them build a life around me but never with me. My mother perfected what I now call sweet control. She never yelled. She didn't need to. She used her smile like a blade, soft on the surface but sharp enough to make you bleed on the inside. "Morgan, honey, don't be so intense," she'd say when I spoke up. "Don't make a big deal out of everything." She called it keeping the peace, but what she really meant was keeping me small. Evan could make a mess, and everyone laughed. I could speak a truth, and suddenly I was the problem. It's strange how those moments shape you without you noticing. One summer when I was 16, I got accepted into a leadership program that only a handful of students in the state were chosen for. I remember running up the porch steps, letter in hand, so proud I felt like my chest might burst. They were sitting around the kitchen island eating takeout. I held up the letter, expecting at least a flicker of excitement. My mother gave me a smile so light it barely touched her eyes. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said, already turning back to the conversation with Evan about his upcoming football game. My stepfather didn't even glance up. Evan laughed at something on his phone, and I stood there with that piece of paper in my hand, feeling the moment shrink into nothing. A few months later, Evan sprained his ankle at practice. My mother cried. She called the coach. She cooked him special meals. She told everyone at church. When I came home with my ROTC certificate, she asked me to put it somewhere neat so it wouldn't clutter the fridge. I think that was the day I understood my place in their story. Not the hero, not even the supporting character. Just background noise. Still, I kept trying. I joined the Army after graduation. Part of me thought that maybe if I came home in uniform, if I achieved something they couldn't ignore, it would finally make them look at me differently. For a while, it almost worked. My stepfather shook my hand the day I left for basic. My mother wiped tears and told me she was proud. Evan posted a photo of me on his feed with a sarcastic caption, but even that felt like something. I told myself things were changing. They weren't. Each time I came back on leave, Evan got louder, drunker, more careless. My mother defended him like he was a helpless child. "He's just figuring things out," she'd say, while brushing off everything I accomplished like it was nothing more than a phase. I learned to stop expecting applause. What I didn't realize then was that they were teaching me something they'd regret later. They were teaching me how to be quiet long enough to build a storm. I had spent years learning how to make myself smaller for their comfort, but the thing about silence is it doesn't disappear. It waits. It gathers weight. And the night he spit on my medal, all those years of shrinking turned into something sharp, something unbreakable. Looking back now, I see the illusion for what it was. That house, those smiles, those practiced family portraits, they were never a promise. They were a performance. And like any performance, all it takes is one wrong line to make the curtain fall. When I stepped off the transport bus back onto Fort Liberty, the wind cut clean through the air like it always did in early November. The sky was a pale steel gray, the kind that made the flag at the gate snap sharp in the cold. My boots hit the ground with that solid rhythm I had learned to trust. I had just completed an advanced combat readiness course in Arizona, a 6-week blur of dirt heat and controlled chaos. The kind of training designed to break the weak and sharpen the steady. Out there, I wasn't just a name on a roster. I was a staff sergeant with a team that trusted me. That trust mattered. It wasn't a family built on convenient love or fake smiles. It was earned in the dark, in the noise, and the kind of moments that don't make it into speeches. 2 weeks before returning, during a high-intensity field exercise, a Humvee had rolled over on uneven terrain. There was smoke confusion screaming. My body moved before my brain had time to think. I pulled 2 soldiers from the wreck, one with a dislocated shoulder, the other with a leg pinned under twisted steel. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't need to. The medal they pinned to my chest later wasn't about glory. It was about the sound of those 2 men breathing after it was over. It was about the silence after you save a life. I stood there in the dry Arizona air, the commander reading the citation cameras, clicking soldiers clapping, and for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not as a shadow. Not as the quiet one. But as someone who mattered. When I got back to North Carolina, I tucked that feeling inside like a secret I wasn't ready to share. The Army Commendation Medal rested neatly in its case, catching the light on my dresser. I knew better than to expect celebration at home, but a small part of me still hoped. I should have known better. My mother didn't come to the ceremony. She said it was too far. My stepfather sent a one-line text that read, "Congratulations, kiddo," like I had just passed a math test, not pulled 2 men out of a burning vehicle. Evan didn't say anything at all. The first night back at the house, I heard him in the kitchen with my stepfather. Their voices carried just enough through the hallway for me to catch the words that mattered. "She acts like that medal means something," Evan said, his laugh low and cruel. "It's just a piece of metal. She got lucky." My stepfather didn't correct him. He chuckled that quiet rumble that meant he agreed more than he'd ever admit out loud. "She takes everything too seriously," he said. "Always has." I stood in the hallway, my hand on the frame of my door, listening to them talk about me like I wasn't under the same roof, like I wasn't the one keeping this roof over their heads. I let the words settle. They didn't sting the way they used to. Not anymore. They just added to the quiet pile of things I'd never forget. The next morning, I left the house early, long before any of them woke up, and walked the perimeter of the base. Soldiers were already out training in the cold. I breathed in the sharp air. Here, things made sense. Here, respect wasn't optional. When you earned it, you carried it. When you didn't, you stayed silent. On base, my rank meant something. The medal meant something. No one spat on it here. My unit greeted me like I'd been gone for months. There were handshakes, claps on the back, jokes about desert heat and cheap Arizona coffee. Sergeant Williams dropped a folded note on my desk with 3 words on it. "You did good." He didn't say it like a favor. He said it like fact. That's what I loved about the Army. You didn't have to beg to be seen. Your work spoke for itself. And yet when I left the gate and drove down that short stretch of highway toward the house, it felt like crossing into another world. Inside those walls, nothing I did ever mattered. It was like oxygen turning into smoke. My stepfather liked to remind me how grateful I should be that he let my mother live in that house. He never said it directly, but the tone was there. Evan treated the place like it was his kingdom. They liked it that way. My accomplishments didn't fit into their script. When I tried to talk about Arizona over dinner, about the training, about the lives saved, Evan rolled his eyes. "You talk like you're in a movie," he said, stabbing his fork into a pile of mashed potatoes. My stepfather laughed. My mother smiled politely, her fork halfway to her mouth, eyes distant. I didn't finish my plate. In their world, Evan's half-finished business degree mattered more than my commendation medal. His weekend benders were stress while my commitment to the uniform was too serious. I started staying at the barracks more often, not because I had to, but because the silence on base felt cleaner than the silence at home. No backhanded comments, no rolled eyes, no pretending. Out there, I wasn't the quiet girl. I was Staff Sergeant Hale, and that title for me meant more than any last name. But there was something else underneath it all, something I didn't want to admit yet. The more I achieved, the more Evan seemed to look at me like I was a challenge he had to break. The medal was just a trigger. The real issue was what it represented. It was proof that I had carved something for myself that he couldn't touch. And for people like Evan, nothing is more dangerous than being reminded they are small. I noticed the way he looked at that medal whenever he passed it in the hallway. His smile was never warm. It was a slow curl like he was waiting for the perfect moment to make it worthless. And my stepfather, he never stopped him. He let that tension sit in the air, feeding it with every quiet dismissal every time he called me dramatic behind a smirk. On base, I carried the weight of a medal with pride. At home, they tried to grind it down until it felt like nothing. What they didn't know was that every insult, every careless word, every half-smile made me stronger. It built a silence I could weaponize. It turned their disrespect into kindling. They saw a medal they could mock. I saw a line they couldn't cross forever. And the night he did, he found out exactly what that meant. The first cracks didn't show up in one explosive moment. They started small, the way hairline fractures crawl through glass long before it shatters. It began 2 weeks after I got back from Arizona. Evan had been hanging around the house more than usual, drinking earlier in the day, sleeping later in the mornings. I tried to ignore it like I always did, but something about the way he looked at me had changed. It wasn't just his usual smug grin. There was a twitch of something sharper underneath something restless. One night, I came home from the base a little after 1900 hours. I'd stayed late to help 2 younger soldiers prep for an inspection. My boots were still dusted from the motor pool when I opened the door. The house was too quiet. That kind of quiet didn't mean peace. It meant Evan was there. The hallway light was off, but the living room lamp threw a yellow glow onto the floor. I saw the papers before I saw him. My commendation certificate torn clean down the center, lying in a pile on the coffee table like confetti. My stomach went cold. Evan was sitting on the couch, leaning back like he owned the air I breathed. A beer can rested on the armrest, another on the floor. He saw me looking and smiled like a wolf that had just tipped over a chicken coop. "You should frame it," he said, his voice slow, thick with the kind of boredom that hides cruelty. "Oh, wait, you already did with that medal on the wall." I didn't say a word. Not at first. I just stood there in my uniform, staring at the torn certificate, hearing my own heartbeat in my ears. It wasn't about the paper. It was about the message. He wanted to show me what he thought of everything I'd earned. "Evan," I said finally. My voice flat calm. "Years of Army discipline do that to you." "Why?" He shrugged. "Because it's a joke. All of it. You walk around like some kind of hero. It's pathetic." He said it like it was the simplest thing in the world, like breathing, like spitting on something someone else worked for. I stepped forward, not fast, just enough to make him lean back slightly. That was when my mother's bedroom door opened. She stood there in her robe, hair tied back, eyes tired the way they always looked when she didn't want to deal with anything. "What's going on?" she asked. She didn't even look at the certificate. Her eyes went to me first, like I was the problem. "He tore my commendation," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was steady, too steady. Evan laughed softly under his breath. My mother sighed the way people sigh when they're late for something unimportant. "Morgan don't start. He's just stressed. He's been going through a rough patch." That phrase hit like a slap. Stressed. Evan didn't have a job. Evan didn't have responsibilities. Evan didn't have deployments. But he was stressed. And somehow that gave him permission to tear apart something that took me years to build. "He needs help," I said, still calm. Not excuses. She wrapped her robe tighter around her body, shifting uncomfortably like my words were a draft she wanted to close the window on. "He's family," she said finally, as if that settled everything. Then she turned and went back into her room. The door clicked shut behind her. That sound was louder than Evan's laugh. He leaned forward and picked up half of the torn certificate, holding it between his fingers like a cigarette. "See?" he said, grinning. "Even she knows this isn't a big deal." I walked to my room without another word. If I had stayed, I might have done something I couldn't take back. In the Army, disrespect has consequences. At home, it was treated like a joke. That was the first fracture. A week later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't inside the house. It was outside where other people could see. I was in uniform, standing in the driveway after returning from the base. Two neighbors, an older couple who always waved politely when I passed by, were talking to Evan near the porch. They were smiling the kind of gentle smiles people give to the golden boy who can do no wrong. When they saw me, the husband said, "Morgan, we heard about your medal. That's something to be proud of." I nodded and thanked him. But before I could say anything else, Evan cut in. "Yeah," he said with a grin. "They give those things to anyone these days." The couple laughed politely, unsure whether to take it as a joke. Evan wasn't joking. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't give him what he wanted. I just stood there. My silence made him bolder. He leaned against the porch railing, looking me dead in the eyes while he added, "She makes it sound like she dragged someone out of a war zone or something. It was training. She got lucky." The neighbors' smiles faltered. They glanced at me awkwardly, then mumbled something about getting dinner ready and slipped away. Evan chuckled, pleased with himself. I didn't move. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to chip away at me in the one place he could still reach. That night, I sat on the porch after everyone went to bed. The November air stung against my skin, but it felt cleaner than anything inside the house. On base, every word meant something. Every action carried weight. At home, my achievements were toys for Evan to break when he was bored. I started noticing the shift more clearly after that. The longer I wore the uniform, the more out of place I felt in that house. It was like wearing armor in a room full of knives. Each time I stepped through that door, the rules changed. Respect became a punchline. Discipline became something to mock. My stepfather didn't even try to hide it anymore. When Evan made jokes, he laughed along. When Evan crossed the line, my mother smoothed it over. And when I tried to call it out, I became the problem. The fracture widened the night I caught Evan trying to take the medal out of its case. I heard the click of the frame as I came down the hallway. He froze his hand, still hovering near the glass. When our eyes met, he smiled the kind of smile that said, "This isn't about the medal, this is about control." "You don't deserve this," he whispered, not shouted. Whispered, as if it were a fact. I walked away again, but this time it wasn't because I didn't care. It was because something was building. The silence wasn't weakness, it was a fuse. I started spending even more nights at the barracks. The line between base and home wasn't just visible now, it was a canyon. On one side, there was order, respect, and purpose. On the other, there was Evan, my mother, and a house that felt more like enemy territory than home. I didn't know it yet, but the fractures that had started as hairline cracks were already running deep. All it needed was one sharp blow to break the glass completely. It happened on a night that should have been quiet, the kind of cold November night when the base housing neighborhood falls silent after 2,200 hours. I'd just finished a late shift and returned home to the dim porch light flickering above the front door. The house felt still when I stepped inside. My boots sank softly into the carpet. The smell of old whiskey hit me before I even turned on the light. Evan's voice followed a beat later, low and rough, the kind of slur that comes from a bottle emptied too quickly. "You're back," he said from the living room. My stomach tightened. He wasn't supposed to be here this late. Civilian visitors on base housing have restrictions, but my mother always found ways around the rules. She had probably left the door unlocked. Again. I dropped my bag at the entryway and stepped forward. The room glowed faintly from the kitchen light spilling down the hallway. Evan was leaning against the back of the couch, a half-empty bottle hanging from one hand, his hair messy, his shirt wrinkled. His eyes were glassy and mean. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" His voice rose and cracked through the quiet. I didn't answer. I'd learned that with people like Evan, silence cuts deeper than any argument. He staggered a step forward, his socked feet dragging on the carpet. His grin stretched wide but didn't reach his eyes. "You walk around in that uniform like you're something special," he spat out. "You're not. You're just weak." The word cracked against the walls like a slap. My gaze shifted past him toward the wall where the medal hung. That medal had survived sand heat and chaos. It had survived nights when I thought I wouldn't. But it wasn't ready for Evan Riley. He followed my line of sight, and something in him lit up dark and reckless. Before I could move, he turned, leaned close, and spat straight onto the glass covering the medal. The sound was soft. The silence that followed was louder than anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't just spit. It was a line being crossed. A civilian disrespecting a symbol of service in a military home isn't just a personal insult. On base, it's a violation that carries weight. Evan either didn't know or didn't care. "What's wrong?" he said, his voice dragging through the air like a dull blade. "You going to cry about it? You going to run to your little army friends?" His laugh was low, curling at the edges. My hand twitched at my side, not from fear, but from restraint. Every cell in my body told me to react, to push him out to shout. But my training screamed louder. Control is power. Chaos is his ground, not mine. I moved slowly toward the side table where my phone sat. My fingers brushed against the black case and tapped twice on the back. The security app activated without a sound recording both audio and video from the small lens near the top. It was something I'd set up months ago when Evan's presence started turning from irritation to threat. Army life teaches you to document everything when something feels wrong. "You're pathetic," he slurred, leaning closer. I could smell the whiskey on his breath, sharp and sour. "Medals don't make you a soldier. Real soldiers don't need to hide behind shiny things." He poked at the glass with his finger, leaving a smear next to the streak of spit. "Weak. That's what you are." The way he said weak wasn't just to hurt me. It was to make himself feel bigger, louder. But the thing about people like Evan is they never notice when the power in a room shifts. It had already shifted. I straightened my shoulders. My face didn't move, not even a twitch. That bothered him. His grin faltered for a second, just enough for me to see the boy underneath the cruelty, the one who'd spent his life mistaking attention for strength. But then he doubled down. "You think they care about you out there," he said. "They'll forget your name the second you're gone. And when they do, you'll come crawling back here. To us. To me." My jaw locked. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The camera caught every syllable, every smear of spit, every step he took into a hole he'd dug for himself. When he finally ran out of breath, I stepped past him. He flinched like he expected me to scream. Instead, I reached up and carefully lifted the medal from the wall. My fingers pressed against the cold glass where the spit was still sliding. The contrast between that cold and the steady heat in my chest felt like a fault line cracking open. Evan's voice came again, quieter but more vicious. "Weak," he whispered. I turned my back on him and walked toward the door. Behind me, his laugh followed louder now, desperate for a reaction I refused to give. I opened the door slowly. The cold air outside rushed in a clean slice through the stench of his whiskey. The porch light flickered weakly above me, and somewhere down the street a security patrol car rolled past its red beam, cutting through the dark like a pulse. I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me. The sound of his laughter became muffled, trapped behind walls he didn't know were already collapsing around him. I looked down at the medal in my hand, the spit gleaming under the porch light like a scar. For a moment, I let the night settle over me. The base housing was quiet, ordered still. I belonged to that world, not to the chaos behind the door. I lifted my phone, confirmed the recording. Every word was there. Every insult. Every deliberate step over a line he shouldn't have crossed. My breath came out in thin, white clouds. I tightened my grip around the medal, not as a victim, but as someone gathering proof. It wasn't just about the insult anymore. This was about consequences, and Evan had just walked straight into them. That night didn't break me. It just confirmed something I had known for years but never said out loud. Blood doesn't make family. Respect does. And he had none left to give. The light above me flickered again, steadying for a brief second. I stood alone in the cold, the metal pressed tight against my palm. Inside that house, he laughed like he'd won something. Outside, I knew better. This was the beginning of the end. The morning after felt colder than any November wind could make it. Sunlight crawled weakly across the front lawn of base housing, but it didn't warm anything. The house smelled faintly of stale liquor and reheated coffee when I walked into the kitchen at 0700. My mother was already at the counter wearing her silk robe, the same one she wore every time she wanted to look calm and composed instead of complicit. My stepfather sat at the table with his usual black coffee, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened hours earlier. Evan wasn't there. I could still feel his voice from the night before, the word weak sliding under my skin like splinters. I placed the medal on the counter between us not to make a point, but because I refused to let it sit in my room like a secret. My mother looked down at it, then up at me. Her expression wasn't shock. It wasn't anger. It was annoyance. "Morgan," she started softly, the way people do when they want to sound reasonable while gutting you. "Evan told us what happened." She poured her coffee with perfect care. "He didn't mean it. He'd been drinking. He feels terrible." My stepfather nodded slowly, still staring at his screen. "He's going through a hard time," he added without looking up. "You know how he gets when he drinks." I almost laughed at that. They said it like that excused everything, like he hadn't crossed a line so clear, even the walls should have felt it. "He came into my house drunk," I said, my voice quiet, steady. "He spit on my medal. He disrespected me, and by doing that, he disrespected everything that uniform stands for. He's not a child. He knew what he was doing." My mother's hand froze midair with her coffee cup. "Morgan," she said again, slower this time, like I was the problem to be solved. "You can't make everything so dramatic. It's just a medal. He made a mistake. Just a medal." I'd heard a lot of things in my life, but that sentence cut deep. "Just a medal," I repeated, my voice still calm, but heavier now. "You have no idea what that medal cost." My stepfather finally looked up then. He exhaled like I was exhausting him. "You need to let it go, kiddo," he said. "Family fights. We don't turn this into some big deal." It wasn't family. It was a battlefield with nice curtains. I stared at the two of them sitting there like a jury that had already decided the verdict before the trial started. My mother's eyes softened like she thought this was kindness. "He said you scared him," she added. "You get intense when you're angry. You always have." Maybe he felt cornered. I took a step back. "He spat on my medal and called me weak. And you're worried he felt cornered." My mother sighed, placing the cup down gently. "Morgan, sweetheart, you have to stop making everything so big. You've always been so reactive. Don't turn this into something it doesn't need to be." That was the moment something broke inside me, but it didn't shatter loudly. It was quiet, like ice fracturing beneath your boots. Evan had crossed the line last night, but they were the ones burning the bridge now. "You'll never hold him accountable," I said quietly. "Not once." My stepfather shrugged. "It's family," he said again, like it was some holy shield that could cover any sin. "Family forgives." I wanted to tell him family also respects boundaries, but that word meant nothing here. It was currency only spent on one person. Evan. I didn't stay long after that. I grabbed my jacket and walked out the door before the cold inside me could turn into something they'd call an outburst. The sky over Fort Liberty was pale blue, the kind of empty blue that makes you feel both alive and hollow at the same time. My boots clicked against the pavement as I headed toward my car. The medal was still in my pocket, cold against my fingers. I drove toward the legal office near the administrative wing of the base. The building wasn't impressive flat concrete walls, the kind of bureaucratic gray that made you forget what daylight felt like, but the second I stepped inside, the air felt different. This wasn't a house that pretended things didn't happen. Here, words had weight, actions had consequences. The woman at the front desk looked up when I showed my ID. "JAG Legal Services," she said, smiling politely. "How can we help?" I explained everything. The words came out steady, clinical, the way they do when you've spent too long burying emotion to survive military structure. Civilian entry after hours, alcohol, harassment, disrespect of a symbol of service on base housing property. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was procedural. She listened carefully, nodding her face neutral but not dismissive. When I finished, she leaned forward slightly. "Do you have evidence, Staff Sergeant?" she asked. My fingers tightened around my phone in my pocket. "Yes," I said. "Audio and video." She nodded once, her tone shifting from polite to precise. "That helps. A lot. If the incident happened on base housing, this falls under federal jurisdiction and can involve CID investigation. Depending on how it's classified, it could lead to a court-martial if any active duty personnel are implicated, or a federal case if a civilian trespassed or harassed a service member." I stood there breathing evenly, absorbing every word. "He's a civilian," I said finally, "but he lives in the same house with my family. He's been here before." "Then it's still trespassing if he was intoxicated and acting aggressively," she explained, "especially if you have proof." Her words were solid, steady, like bricks being stacked after years of my family trying to build walls out of fog. "Would you like to initiate a formal report?" she asked. I hesitated for half a second, not because I doubted what I wanted to do, but because of the weight of what it meant. This wasn't like arguing at the dinner table anymore. This was real, and maybe for the first time, Evan wouldn't be able to hide behind my mother's excuses. "Yes," I said, "I would." She slid a clipboard toward me with the initial complaint form. My name, his name, time, location. I wrote it all down with the same precision I used on a rifle range. When I finished, I handed it back. She scanned it quickly, then looked up. "This is clear," she said. "CID will review the evidence. You should prepare to give a statement in the next 48 hours. I nodded, thanked her, and stepped back outside. The sunlight was brighter now, cutting clean lines across the pavement. My breath came out steady, measured. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel afraid either. I just felt still. That kind of still that only comes after deciding something final. When I got back to the house, Evan was passed out on the couch. My mother was watching television like nothing had happened. She looked at me as I walked in, but didn't say a word. Neither did I. The air between us had turned into something thick and heavy. She thought this was just another one of those family incidents that would fade after a few days of silence. But this wasn't going to fade. It had been documented, time-stamped, submitted. The military doesn't run on emotional excuses. It runs on facts. That night, I sat on my bed with the medal in my hand. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just stared at it under the dim lamp. For years, I thought being strong meant staying silent to keep the peace. But peace isn't real when only one person pays the price for it. The truth was simple now. My family would protect Evan no matter what. But the system I served wouldn't. The system would listen, and that was all I needed. My mother might still think of me as the quiet girl who always forgave, but the woman holding that medal had already made her move. What came next wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a reckoning. And this time, they wouldn't be able to laugh it away. The shift didn't happen with a scream. It happened with a plan. By the time the sun set on that second day, I had already decided that silence would no longer be a shield. It would be a weapon. I'd spent most of my life in that house absorbing, shrinking, letting things pass. But the Army had taught me something that my family never understood. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Quiet means precise. And precision wins wars. I sat on my bunk that night, my Medal for Valor resting on the table in front of me, the weight of it pressing against the still air. My phone sat beside it, the recording from that night still safe in its encrypted folder. Evan's voice echoed through the earbuds, his laugh, his words, the slur in his tone, the spit hitting glass. That sound alone carried more truth than any excuse my family could invent. They'd called me dramatic. This recording was the opposite of drama. It was fact. The next morning, I went straight to CID. The Criminal Investigation Division office at Fort Liberty wasn't a place most people walked into casually. It was cold and plain, the kind of building where words were treated like evidence, not emotion. The man at the front desk checked my ID, nodded once, and led me down the hallway to an interview room. Inside, a CID special agent introduced herself as Special Agent Ramirez, sharp eyes, steady voice, someone who had seen too many stories like mine. I laid it all out. The civilian entry after hours, the intoxication, the harassment, the disrespect of federal property and military symbols. And then I played the recording. The silence in that room after Evan's voice echoed off the walls was different than at home. It wasn't dismissive. It was focused. Ramirez leaned back slightly, folded her hands on the table, and said, "Staff Sergeant Hale, this is clean evidence. You did the right thing by recording." I nodded, but my hands were tied around the metal case resting in my lap. She continued, "This falls under federal jurisdiction. He's a civilian, which means the case will likely move toward a federal harassment and trespass charge. But because it happened on base housing and involved disrespecting an official decoration, it can also be linked to military disciplinary channels. We'll open a case file today. JAG will be looped in. If he was a service member, this would be court-martial territory. As a civilian, it's federal." I'd imagined this conversation in my head 100 different ways, mostly with people shrugging it off like my mother had, but hearing someone say it out loud with weight felt like a door unlocking. Ramirez asked for the footage from my security camera facing the porch. I had installed it months ago after one too many nights of Evan showing up drunk. I pulled up the app on my phone and handed her the files. It showed him staggering through the front door at 2:57 a.m., the same time stamped on the audio. Everything lined up. "You've done more than most," she said, scrolling through the footage carefully. "You documented. You kept your cool. That's what builds cases." I didn't smile. This wasn't about feeling good. This was about building something solid enough that not even my mother's excuses could crack it. After the interview, I walked to the JAG legal office again to officially link my CID case. The officer on duty, Captain Lee, reviewed the preliminary report Ramirez had sent ahead. He looked up at me with the quiet kind of respect soldiers give each other when no words are needed. "You did this right," he said. "You stayed inside the lines. This is exactly how you make sure justice isn't just talked about. It's delivered." He explained the process clearly. CID would conduct their investigation, interview witnesses if needed, and gather statements. Because it happened on federal property, the U.S. Attorney's Office could choose to file charges. In the meantime, a protective order could be issued banning Evan from entering base housing. "Do you want to pursue that order?" Captain Lee asked. "Yes," I said without hesitation. He nodded and handed me the form. As I signed, I felt something click into place. This wasn't me begging my family to see me anymore. This was me moving forward without them. By late afternoon, the CID case file was open. Evan had no idea what was coming. He was probably still sitting on the couch somewhere, convinced the world worked the way it always had his way. My mother likely believed this would blow over like everything else. But this time it wouldn't. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Confrontation would give him the satisfaction of seeing me angry. I wasn't angry anymore. I was surgical. Over the next few days, I tightened every detail. I gave CID a full written statement. I cataloged every instance of his previous harassment dates times even screenshots of text messages he'd sent after drinking. They weren't explosive, but they painted a picture, a man who crossed lines because no one ever stopped him. Now, someone was. Ramirez called me in for a follow-up. "He'll be served with a base exclusion order within 48 hours, she said. "He won't be allowed to step foot here again. If he does, MPs will remove him. If he resists, federal marshals can be involved. This isn't a slap on the wrist." I nodded, absorbing every word. For years, my family's power had come from silence, my silence. But the moment I spoke to the Army, it became something they couldn't control. At home, they could call me dramatic. Here I was, Staff Sergeant Hale with evidence chain of command and the law on my side. That night, I drove past the house without going inside. I didn't need to breathe that air anymore. Instead, I sat in the empty parking lot near the parade field. The wind was sharp against the windshield. My phone buzzed once. A message from my mother. "He's sorry. Don't make this worse than it is." I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I locked it and tossed it onto the passenger seat. That sentence was exactly why this was happening. The turning point wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet and clean, like a knife sliding through fabric. I was no longer reacting. I was moving. Evan's actions were no longer a family matter. They were a case number with attached evidence and procedures he couldn't laugh off. The next morning, CID called to confirm the protective order had been served. He'd been escorted off base by military police. My mother had called the legal office 3 times trying to downplay it. It hadn't worked. Her voice no longer mattered here. Standing outside my unit building, I felt the difference in my lungs. The air didn't feel trapped anymore. It felt sharp, real. I had control of my narrative for the first time. I walked past a row of soldiers doing PT, their cadence echoing down the street. The sound was steady, familiar. It reminded me why I'd chosen this life in the first place. The Army wasn't perfect, but it had rules. Rules that didn't bend for people like Evan. That night, I locked the door to my room, placed the medal back on the wall, and stood in silence. It wasn't the fragile kind anymore. It was the silence of someone who has already set the battlefield before the enemy knows a war has started. For years, Evan had played his part as the untouchable golden boy. My mother had played hers as the woman who smoothed over every ugly crack. And I had played mine as the quiet one. But now the script was in my hands. The smart counterattack wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity, about making sure the system heard me when my family refused to. This was my terrain now, and Evan had just stepped into it blind. The courtroom at Fort Liberty wasn't like the grand courtrooms you see in movies. It was smaller, colder, stripped of anything ornamental. Rows of wooden benches stretched back beneath humming fluorescent lights, and the flag behind the judge's bench hung perfectly straight. No wind, no movement. Everything about the room said one thing: facts speak here, not feelings. I sat at the petitioner's table in uniform, my shoulders square, hands folded neatly in front of me. My JAG counsel, Captain Lee, sat to my right. His quiet presence was the kind of steady I needed. Evan entered a few minutes later, flanked by my mother and stepfather. He wasn't in handcuffs. This was a hearing, not a criminal sentencing. But his smirk was enough to make it feel like he thought none of this was real. He wore a pressed button-up shirt and jeans like he was showing up to brunch, not standing in front of a federal judge. My mother clutched her purse tight, whispering something into his ear as they walked. My stepfather followed expression blank. Evan's eyes locked on me, and he tilted his head just enough to let me know he still thought this was a game. He thought the same rules that had always protected him would save him again. The judge entered a silver-haired man with a straight posture and eyes that didn't waste time on performance. We stood. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced, and the weight of the room shifted instantly. The assistant U.S. attorney opened the proceedings with a crisp statement. "Your Honor, this case concerns a civilian who trespassed onto Fort Liberty housing while intoxicated and engaged in harassment against an active-duty service member. The incident includes verbal threats and the desecration of an officially awarded military decoration. We will provide evidence including audio and video recordings of the event." Evan's attorney, a local man with too much confidence in his cheap Navy suit, adjusted his tie and stood. "Your Honor, we are here because of a family misunderstanding. My client, Mr. Evan Riley, had too much to drink and said some regrettable things. But this is not a federal matter. This is family drama that's been blown out of proportion by a highly emotional sister who," Staff Sergeant Captain Lee corrected coolly. The lawyer blinked but continued. "She's making this into something it's not." The lawyer added a faint smirk, tugging at the corner of his mouth. The judge leaned back slightly. "Counselor, I'll determine what this is. Continue." Evan's attorney launched into a smooth little speech about how Evan was a good young man, how my family was close, how this was not worth ruining a life over. He used every trick I'd heard at family dinners growing up: soft words, misdirection, minimization. My mother sat behind him nodding, clutching a tissue like she was the one on trial. My stepfather sighed dramatically, shaking his head like this was some embarrassing misunderstanding. Then it was our turn. Captain Lee didn't waste time. He stood calm as ever. "Your Honor, I'll be brief. There's nothing subjective about this incident. My client is a staff sergeant in the United States Army. The defendant, a civilian, entered base housing, intoxicated, verbally harassed her, and deliberately spat on a Medal for Valor that was awarded to her for heroism during a live field training rescue operation. This is not about hurt feelings. This is about documented misconduct and the deliberate disrespect of a military service member and federal property." The judge nodded slowly. Captain Lee tapped the laptop in front of him and the courtroom screen flickered to life. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to play a portion of the audio recording captured on the night of November 11th. Permission granted, the judge said. The audio began. It was grainy at first, the sound of footsteps on the carpet, a door opening, but then Evan's voice filled the room. You think you're better than me, don't you? The laughter followed. Ugly mean, the same sound that had crawled under my skin that night. You're weak, Morgan. A medal doesn't make you a soldier. The spit hit the glass with a wet, distinct sound that made several people in the gallery shift in their seats. The audio ended in silence. That silence inside the courtroom wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Even Evan's attorney, who'd been smiling like this with some lightweight argument, straightened uncomfortably. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly as he glanced down at the transcript in front of him. Evan shifted in his chair. For the first time since this began, he wasn't smirking. He was pale, his hands gripping his knees too tightly. Captain Lee didn't add theatrics. He didn't need to. Your Honor, he said simply, that is the sound of deliberate disrespect. That is not family drama. That is evidence. The assistant U.S. attorney stepped forward to clarify the jurisdiction. Additionally, Your Honor, the defendant entered the base intoxicated without clearance, which constitutes trespassing on federal property. He directed harassment at a service member in her residence and desecrated an official military decoration. The law does not distinguish family drama from criminal conduct. The judge looked at Evan's lawyer. Do you wish to respond? The man cleared his throat. Your Honor, clearly my client was inebriated. He regrets his words. He never intended to insult the United States military. The judge cut him off sharply, but he did, he said flatly. Intoxication is not a defense here. Evan's hands started to shake. I watched the realization creep into his face, like cold water spreading through cracks. Does the victim's commanding officer wish to speak? The judge asked. LTC Carter. My battalion commander rose from the gallery. His uniform was crisp, his posture unyielding. He walked to the front of the courtroom with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need volume to command a room. Your Honor, he began, voice firm. I've served for 24 years. I've seen young soldiers earn their place through discipline, sweat, and sacrifice. Staff Sergeant Hale is one of them. She earned that medal because she saved lives. And while the Army doesn't hand out respect lightly, it demands it in return. What Mr. Riley did was not a private matter. It was an act of deliberate dishonor. And we do not overlook dishonor here. The judge nodded once. The room stayed silent. Evan stared at the floor now, the arrogance stripped away. My mother's hands clutched the tissue tighter. My stepfather sat rigid as if finally understanding that this wasn't something they could charm their way out of. LTC Carter turned to the bench. When civilians cross into this world and try to trample on what soldiers have earned, they don't just insult one person. They insult the uniform. They insult everyone who's worn it. And that is something we answer to. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It landed like steel. The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled. Mr. Riley, he said slowly, this isn't a dinner table argument. This isn't a matter of your sister being too dramatic. This is federal property. This is the U.S. Army. And this is the weight of your choices. Do you understand? Evan didn't speak. The judge's tone sharpened. Do you understand? Yes, Evan finally muttered, barely audible. The judge turned to the attorneys. The evidence is clear. I am granting a permanent base exclusion order. Mr. Riley is hereby prohibited from entering Fort Liberty or any military installation. This matter will also be referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for further review. Harassment of a service member and trespass are federal violations. The gavel hit the wood once. The sound rang through the room like a clean break. Public exposure doesn't always come in the form of shouting matches. Sometimes it comes in silence so complete that even the person who thought they'd never be held accountable has nowhere left to hide. Evan didn't look at me when they let him out. He didn't have to. His silence said everything. The same silence I'd carried for years was now wrapping around him. As the courtroom cleared, LTC, Carter gave me a small nod, just one. It said what no speech could. You held your ground. You did this right. And for the first time, the weight that medal represented didn't feel like something I carried alone. It felt like the entire room had seen it for what it was. Real. Untouchable. It took exactly 7 days for them to show up at my door. 7 days after the courtroom went silent. 7 days after the judge stripped Evan of the illusion that nothing he did ever carried consequences. I had spent that week in my new apartment just outside the Fort Liberty gate, surrounded by the quiet kind of space that didn't hold anyone else's expectations. No fake smiles, no stale whiskey smell, no laughter behind closed doors. Just air. The sun had set early that night. A soft gray light from the parking lot spilled through the blinds when I heard the knock. It wasn't a surprise. I'd been waiting for it. I opened the door, and there they were. My mother with her carefully pressed beige coat, my stepfather with his stiff shoulders, and Evan behind them. He looked smaller now, but not in a way that made me feel pity. His hair was unkempt, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a jacket too thin for the cold. The arrogance he'd worn like armor was gone. What was left was desperation. My mother tried to smile first, that same brittle smile she used when she wanted to convince me everything was fine. "Morgan," she said softly, "can we talk?" I didn't answer. I stepped aside without inviting them in, but they entered anyway, like they always did. Evan hesitated at the threshold as if the walls themselves rejected him. He shuffled in, avoiding my eyes. My stepfather closed the door behind them with a slow click. I stood near the counter, arms crossed, saying nothing. My mother smoothed the lapels of her coat like she was preparing for a performance. "Sweetheart," she began, "this has gone too far. We need to fix this." Her voice was soft, almost rehearsed. My stepfather nodded, his mouth set in that condescending half-smile that used to make me feel small. "He's your brother," he said. "We're family. Family forgives." The word family hit the air like a stone dropped in a frozen lake. Evan finally looked up, his eyes glassy, not from alcohol this time, but something worse. Fear. He stepped forward slowly, hands still buried in his pockets. "Morgan," he said, voice trembling. "Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." I raised a hand not to silence him, but to keep him exactly where he was. "Don't lie," I said quietly. His breath caught. He swallowed, then tried again. "I messed up, okay? I was drunk. I didn't think. But this is too much. They said I could face charges. I could lose everything." I almost laughed at that, at the way he said lose everything, like everything was something he'd ever earned. My mother stepped closer, her eyes soft but calculating. "Morgan, honey, he knows he was wrong. He's terrified. The lawyers said if you drop the complaint, if you help, maybe this won't ruin his future. He's family. We need to stand together." I looked at her, at the woman who had built an entire life on pretending nothing was ever her fault, and something inside me went very still. "You didn't say a word when he spat on my medal," I said. "You laughed." She froze for a fraction of a second, and that tiny crack was all the honesty she didn't mean to show. "We didn't know how bad it was," she whispered. "He was drunk. He was just being stupid." My stepfather folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "This isn't a federal case. This is family business. You don't drag family into court." I stared at him, and for a moment I saw exactly what had kept this cycle alive for so many years. Family business. That phrase had buried every boundary I'd ever tried to set, but not anymore. Evan stepped forward again. His eyes were red. "Morgan, please. I'm begging you. I'll do anything. Just please don't let them take this any further. We're family." That word again. Family. They had used it like a shield for years, as if saying it was enough to make everything acceptable. I let the silence stretch. I watched Evan squirm under it. My mother's hand hovered near his arm as if she could still protect him. My stepfather stood like he believed this was just another argument he'd win by waiting for me to soften. But I wasn't soft anymore. I walked toward the table where the medal sat in its glass case, catching the dim light of the kitchen lamp. I picked it up and turned it slowly, the glass smooth against my fingers. "Family doesn't spit on your honor," I said finally. My voice flat, cold. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. My stepfather's face tightened, the lines around his mouth cutting deeper. Evan flinched like I had struck him. His mouth opened and closed, as if the words he wanted to say got trapped somewhere between shame and the old habit of expecting forgiveness. I stepped closer to him, and for the first time in my life, he looked down instead of up. "Do you know what this medal means?" I asked quietly. "Do you have any idea what it cost, the nights, the training, the blood, the lives I pulled out of hell? And you stood in my house on federal property and spat on it like it was nothing. You didn't just insult me, Evan. You insulted everything I swore to protect, and they let you." My mother shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. "Morgan, please. We can fix this." I took a step back, the medal still in my hand. "You can't fix something you were never willing to acknowledge." My stepfather's voice hardened. "You've made your point. Don't destroy his life over a mistake." I met his stare without flinching. He destroyed his own life when he decided my honor was less valuable than his ego. Evan's knees buckled slightly. He reached up and wiped his face with the back of his hand like a child. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't think?" "No," I said. "You did. You thought it wouldn't matter. You thought no one would ever hold you accountable. But you were wrong." My mother stepped forward again, hand outstretched, but I didn't move. "Morgan," she pleaded, "he's your brother." I shook my head slowly. "No, he's not. He's the man who spat on my honor, and you're the people who stood by and watched." The silence after that was sharp, slicing through the room like glass under pressure. My mother's shoulders shook, whether from anger or regret, I couldn't tell. My stepfather clenched his jaw so tight it looked painful. Evan's breathing came in short, uneven bursts. He looked at me like he was seeing someone he didn't recognize. Maybe he was. I wasn't the quiet girl who kept the peace anymore. I was the woman who had built a line he couldn't cross again. I opened the door and stepped aside, not with warmth, but with finality. "Get out," I said calmly. My mother blinked at me like she hadn't heard right. "Morgan, get out!" My stepfather grabbed Evan's arm, but Evan didn't move at first. He stared at me, his lips trembling. "Please," he whispered. "Please don't do this. I didn't do this." I replied. "You did." They walked out slowly, the cold night air pouring in as the door opened wider. My mother turned back once her face streaked with tears. My stepfather's hand pressed against her back, steering her away. Evan lingered on the threshold for a breath longer. Eyes wet, face pale. He opened his mouth again, but no sound came out. I shut the door before he could find the words. The sound of the latch locking echoed in the apartment like a full stop. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing in their house. I felt like they were standing outside of mine. The medal sat in my palm, cool and solid proof that I had drawn the line and finally meant it. The same silence they once used to bury me now belonged to me, and it was louder than anything they could ever say. The day the verdict came down, the air at Fort Liberty was cold and dry, the kind that bit through uniform fabric and settled into your bones. I had known the outcome for days. The legal team had walked me through the process step by step. But when the U.S. Attorney's Office officially issued the final ruling, it didn't feel like just a piece of paper. It felt like a door closing for good. Evan was found guilty on both counts, trespassing on federal property and harassment of a service member. No more excuses, no more family dinners with forced smiles, no more pretending what he did was just a bad night. The base exclusion order was made permanent. He was barred from entering any U.S. military installation nationwide. Federal law didn't care that he was my stepbrother. It cared about the facts. My mother's world cracked the moment she got the notice that her visitor privileges were revoked too. It wasn't about punishing her, but base security didn't play favorites. Her dependent access card was deactivated overnight. She called me the next morning, her voice small, the weight of reality pressing down on her carefully constructed denial. She wanted to blame the system. She wanted to say it was unfair. But what she couldn't bring herself to admit was that she'd built the rope that eventually pulled them out of my life. Evan faced community service, a fine, and a criminal record that would follow him everywhere. It wasn't a prison sentence, but it was permanent. His name was now tied to a federal offense. Jobs, security checks, housing applications, every door would ask that question, and the answer would always come back to the night he thought he could spit on my honor and walk away laughing. My stepfather tried to challenge the decision. He called legal offices, wrote letters, even tried to speak to someone in the chain of command. But that's the thing about the military. It doesn't bend for family sob stories. The process was clean, documented, unshakable. The evidence was undeniable. He finally stopped calling when the legal liaison made it clear that further attempts to contact my unit could be considered harassment. For once, his voice didn't carry weight anymore. I didn't celebrate. It wasn't a victory with confetti and fireworks. It was quiet, steady, like watching a storm finally break after years of tension in the air. One by one, the threads that had tied me to them unraveled, not because I pulled harder, but because the truth finally did what it was supposed to do. At the unit, things moved forward. The command team called me in one afternoon. I sat in LTC Carter's office, the blinds half drawn, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. He didn't make speeches. He handed me the memorandum recommending me for promotion to Sergeant First Class. "You handled yourself with discipline," he said. "You didn't break the line. You said it." I nodded, the weight of the document heavy in my hand. And he added, his voice lower. "There's a closed-door commendation ceremony next week. No press, no spectacle, just your people. That medal you defended deserves to be worn by someone who understands what it means." That night, for the first time in months, I slept without waking at 3 a.m., listening for footsteps that weren't supposed to be there. The lock on my door didn't feel like a defense anymore. It felt like a boundary I owned. News about Evan spread quietly around the base. Soldiers talk, civilians whisper. But in the Army, respect isn't given for being loud. It's given for standing your ground. The looks I got weren't pity. They were recognition. Quiet nods in the hallway. A sergeant major who paused after morning formation to say, "Good on you, Staff Sergeant." A private who whispered, "Ma'am, that took guts." I didn't need a headline. That was enough. My mother tried to call a few more times, her voice on voicemail shifting between pleading, blaming, and finally silence. She didn't know how to exist outside the web of excuses she'd woven. She'd lost her access to the base, the one place she loved to parade her image of a proud military family. The same gate that once opened for her with a polite salute now stayed locked. I didn't answer her calls. Not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say. The final piece of the fallout came 2 weeks later during a closed-door ceremony in the battalion headquarters. The room was small, stripped of anything unnecessary, just like every part of this journey had been. LTC Carter stood at the front, flanked by my platoon sergeant and a handful of soldiers I trusted. No media, no family, no applause. Just the Army. He called my name. "Staff Sergeant Morgan Hale." I stepped forward. The same medal Evan had spat on now hung perfectly polished against my chest. Carter's voice carried the kind of weight that made people straighten their backs without realizing it. In the face of personal attack and dishonor, Staff Sergeant Hale upheld the values of this institution with clarity, strength, and dignity. She did not allow chaos to dictate her actions. She trusted the system she serves, and today that system recognizes her not only for what she's done, but for what she represents. He pinned the promotion insignia to my uniform himself. The applause was quiet, but solid, the kind that didn't need volume to be felt. When it was over, I stepped outside into the cool air. The base looked the same as it always had. Neat lawns, sharp edges, soldiers moving with purpose, but everything felt different. It was mine again. Evan's shadow wasn't here anymore. My mother's excuses couldn't reach past the gate. My stepfather's voice no longer echoed through these walls. I walked toward the parade field and watched the flag flutter against the late afternoon sky. I thought about the girl who used to walk into that house and swallow every insult to keep the peace. She would have begged for them to understand, to love her, to protect her. But that girl wasn't me anymore. I wasn't fighting for their approval. I was defending something bigger. Honor isn't a family heirloom you pass around. It's earned, and when someone tries to destroy it, you make sure the consequences echo louder than their cruelty. The Army had its flaws, but that courtroom, that verdict, that line I drew, they were all reminders that this time I wasn't alone in the fight. When Evan stood at the threshold of my apartment begging for forgiveness, he still believed the world would bend. But the world didn't bend this time. It held. He lost access to the one place he thought he could always walk through. My mother lost the illusion that family ties could override consequences. My stepfather lost the ability to control the narrative, and I gained something simple and unshakable, my voice. That night after the ceremony, I placed the medal back on its hook. It caught the soft light of the lamp the way it always had, but it wasn't just a decoration anymore. It was proof of the line I drew and the price they paid when they crossed it. Justice didn't come with rage or screaming. It came with quiet, measured steps. One fact after another. One consequence after the next. I didn't need to look back to know that their house would be filled with the silence of everything they lost. They had built their world on my silence. Now they would live in the silence I left behind. The first morning I woke up in my new apartment outside Fort Liberty felt like breathing air that didn't belong to anyone else. No footsteps down the hallway, no voices trying to control the temperature of my world. Just silence and sunlight cutting through the thin blinds warming the corner of the small kitchen table where I'd left the medal overnight. The quiet wasn't sharp anymore. It didn't weigh me down. It stretched out wide like something I could finally step into without asking permission. I moved slowly, deliberately making coffee in the tiny kitchen as the morning hum of traffic began to build on the road outside. The world had moved on, but so had I. The medal hung from my fingertips for a second before I set it down on the soft cloth and polished the glass. My hands didn't shake like they had that night when Evan spit on it. I wiped each edge carefully, tracing the etched lettering I had once believed could be mocked out of existence. It couldn't. The medal hadn't changed. I had. I hung it back on the wall right above my desk, perfectly straight, exactly where I could see it every morning. Not as a reminder of what he did, but of what I refused to let him take. The apartment itself wasn't fancy. One bedroom, a small balcony overlooking a patch of green, just far enough from the base to feel like mine, but close enough to make the drive easy. For the first time in years, every object in this space was something I chose. Not something I inherited, not something I had to accept because it was convenient for someone else. Just mine. My uniform hung on the back of a chair, pressed and sharp. The boots by the door were aligned just how I liked them. No one would move them again. By Oro 700 I had already laced up those boots. My life had always run on structure, but this felt different. This wasn't control imposed from the outside. This was discipline I built for myself. I drove toward the base, the gate guard saluting as I passed through. My mother's access card wouldn't work anymore. Evan would never step foot here again. That gate used to feel like the line between two worlds, the one where I wore the uniform and the one where I was the family scapegoat. Now the world on the other side of the gate was the only one that mattered. That week I signed up to join the mentorship program for young female soldiers. I'd seen too many of them come through the ranks carrying their own versions of family scars. The Army can forge steel out of you, but the weight of what waits at home can bend even the strongest spine. I wasn't going to let that happen to them. The orientation room smelled like coffee and whiteboard markers. Rows of young women in uniform sat quietly, some straight-backed others with that quiet storm in their eyes I recognized from my own reflection years ago. The program coordinator handed me a clipboard and said, "You don't have to say anything big today. Just tell them why you're here." I stepped to the front, the medal pinned on my chest catching the overhead light. It wasn't a speech I'd rehearsed. It didn't need to be. "My name is Staff Sergeant Morgan Hale," I began. "I've served for 12 years. I've seen combat training long nights and hard mornings, but the hardest battles I ever fought didn't happen out there." I gestured toward the distant training fields through the window. They happened in a house that called itself family. No one moved. No one breathed loudly. When someone tries to take your worth from you, especially someone who's supposed to protect you, it can make you believe you're small. It can make you think silence is safer than standing. But here's the thing. Once you draw that line, once you say no, once you choose your honor over their comfort, everything changes. Their eyes followed me, and for a moment I saw my younger self sitting among them, desperate for someone to say what I had just said out loud. I didn't tell them every detail. I didn't have to. They didn't need my pain. They needed proof it was survivable. After the session, one of the youngest soldiers approached me outside, maybe 19 or 20. She hesitated at first, her hand gripping the strap of her bag. "Ma'am," she said softly, "my brother—" She didn't have to finish. I recognized the tremor in her voice. It was the same tremor I used to swallow. I didn't give her advice she wasn't ready for. I gave her my card and said, "You don't have to handle it alone. Not anymore." As I walked back to my truck, I realized something that should have terrified me, but didn't. The story that had once chained me to shame wasn't just mine anymore. It was a weapon now sharp and steady, something I could use to cut other women loose from their own cages. Days turned into weeks. Evan faded into a distant, irrelevant noise. My mother stopped calling altogether. My stepfather didn't show up at my door again. The silence they left behind didn't hurt. It felt clean. My career moved forward steadily. Promotion orders came through officially, my name printed in black ink on white paper. My locker at the unit was rearranged to reflect the new rank. A few of the younger soldiers clapped me on the shoulder, the kind of congratulations that comes from respect, not pity. One Saturday morning, I sat on the small balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. The world looked simple from up there. Birds cut across the pale blue sky, traffic murmured faintly in the distance, and for once I wasn't waiting for the next hit of chaos. There was no crisis I had to brace against. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. When people talk about revenge, they imagine fire, explosions, big moments. But this was the real revenge. This quiet, this air, this freedom. Evan would live with the consequences of that night every time a background check came up. My mother would live with the locked gate she once breezed through. And me, I'd live with the medal still shining on the wall and a life built without their shadows. That afternoon, I stopped by the base gym. My unit was running drills and the cadence echoed against the walls. It was steady, rhythmic, familiar. One of my soldiers called out, "Hey, Sergeant Hale, you running with us today?" I smiled, not the forced smile I used to wear at home, but something real. "Yeah," I said, "I'll run." The trail behind the gym cut through a strip of woods where the air smelled like pine and cold earth. I ran with them boots hitting the dirt in unison. The rhythm of it steadied something deep inside me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was leading. That night, I came home to the apartment and set my boots by the door, exactly where I wanted them. I poured myself a glass of water, sat down at the table, and stared at the medal. Not because I needed to remember the pain, because I wanted to remember the moment I chose myself. I touched the edge of the glass case and whispered quietly, almost to the air, "Never again." The wind outside rustled against the balcony railing. The base lights shimmered faintly in the distance. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need anything that came with their names. All I needed was this, my space, my air, my life on my terms. And as the night settled around me, I understood something simple but unshakable. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's the quiet sound of your own heartbeat in a room no one can take from you. Sometimes it's a medal hanging straight on a wall that no one will ever spit on again. Sometimes it's just peace. They thought they could spit on my honor and walk away like nothing had happened. They thought my silence was permanent, that the girl who used to swallow her pain would stay buried under their laughter. But they forgot something. In the Army, honor isn't a decoration. It isn't a ribbon to be mocked or a medal to be disrespected. It's a line you don't cross. And when someone crosses it, consequences follow. Real ones. Unshakable ones. The sun was just beginning to rise when I stepped outside that morning. The air was cold enough to sting the kind that wakes every nerve in your body and makes you feel alive. The sky over Fort Liberty was pale gold stretched wide and clean. I wore my uniform with the medal pinned to my chest, not as a shield, but as something earned. The same medal that had once been a target now caught the morning light and threw it back at the world like a promise. I walked down the small path leading from my apartment to the street, the sound of gravel crunching under my boots. For months, I had lived waiting for the next blow, the next word, the next moment they'd try to make me feel smaller. That wait was gone now. It didn't happen in a single moment. It happened in 100 quiet choices. Standing still at 300 hours when he spat on it, turning my pain into evidence, walking into that courtroom with my head high, saying no when they begged. It was a chain reaction I had built one step at a time, and it ended here with me walking toward a day that belonged to no one else but me. The world outside was moving like it always had. Soldiers on their way to PT, cars humming past the gate, the flag beginning to rise with the dawn, but everything felt sharper, clearer, as if I'd finally stepped out of a fog I didn't know I'd been breathing for years. This wasn't a story about revenge alone. It was about reclaiming everything they thought they had the right to take. I reached the end of the path and stopped for a moment looking back at the apartment. It wasn't just a building. It was the first place where my story didn't revolve around them. No one told me when to come home. No one laughed behind a door when I bled. No one spat on my name and called it love. It was mine, every inch of it. The metal gleamed against the early light, and in that reflection, I saw not the night he tried to humiliate me, but the woman who didn't bend, the woman who took every word, every insult, every betrayal and built a wall of truth they couldn't climb over, the woman who fought back without ever lowering herself to their level. They were out there now, living in the silence they created. My mother without access to the world she once used to polish her pride. My stepfather with his empty threats that no one listened to anymore. Evan carrying the mark of his actions on every form he'd fill for the rest of his life. And me, I walked away clean. It's funny how people think strength is about screaming louder than the person trying to hurt you. It's not. Real strength is quiet. It's the kind of silence that stands firm when they expect you to break. It's the courtroom going still when the truth hits the air like a hammer. It's the sound of the door closing on their apologies. It's a medal shining in the sun after someone tried to spit on it. I took a deep breath and kept walking my steps steady, my boots sinking into the gravel with a rhythm that felt like certainty. Behind me, the past was sealed. Ahead of me, the future was mine. If there's one thing this taught me, it's this: sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones who break you first. But they don't get to decide how your story ends. You do. So, if you're listening to this and you've ever had to fight for your own dignity, even against the people who share your blood or your home, know this: you are not weak for standing alone. You are dangerous to the lies they built. You are the line they shouldn't have crossed. Have you ever had to fight for your own dignity, even against family? Tell me below. I want to hear your story, because silence doesn't protect the truth. We do. As the sun rose higher, the metal caught another glint of light, and I walked forward without looking back. The music in my head wasn't loud. It was steady, like the beat of a heart that finally belonged to me. Fade out.